I never thought the shadows of New York City could hide anything darker than its towering skyscrapers. I've lived here for almost a decade, walked these streets day and night, through rain, snow, and suffocating summer heat. I'd seen it all, at least, that's what I used to think. It started last Tuesday. I had just returned to my cramped apartment in the Lower East Side after a late shift at the diner. Exhausted, I barely noticed a slight chill in the air as I climbed the 5 flights of stairs, the usual noise of the city outside my window a muffled background hum. I collapsed on my bed without undressing, shoes still on, letting the dull ache in my feet fade into the mattress. But sleep wouldn't come. A strange unease hung in the air. It felt like the walls were watching me, the shadows in the corner thicker than usual, like ink blots expanding across the floor. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just another sleepless night in the city that never rests. But as the minutes dragged on, the silence became too oppressive, like the world outside had paused. No honking cabs, no drunken laughter echoing from the street below, just an unnatural stillness. I sat up in bed, glancing at the clock. 3:17 a.m. That's when I heard it. The knock. Soft, hesitant, coming from the apartment next door. Mrs. O'Connor lived there, a sweet old lady who rarely left her home. Her son visited once in a while, but other than that, she was alone. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Mrs. O'Connor? I called through the wall, my voice thin in the quiet. No response. I swung my legs off the bed and crossed to the door, pausing for a second before opening it. The hallway was empty, the usual flickering light bulb casting its sickly yellow glow. Mrs. O'Connor's door stood ajar, just slightly. Something wasn't right. Hello? I called again, stepping into the hall. The smell hit me, then rotten, sour, like something had been left to decay for days. My stomach churned. I moved closer to her door, the floor creaking beneath me. My hand hesitated over the doorknob, heart racing, though not from excitement, but from a growing sense of dread. I pushed the door open. Her apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside her window, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal, except for the stench. It was stronger now, thick in the air, making it hard to breathe. Mrs. O'Connor? I whispered, stepping inside. My foot nudged something, and I glanced down. It was her walker, tipped over on its side, one wheel still slowly spinning. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move forward. The smell grew worse as I reached her living room, and that's when I saw her. Mrs. O'Connor was sitting in her armchair, but something was wrong. Her head was tilted to the side, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Her mouth hung slightly agape, but it was the expression on her face that sent a cold wave of terror through me, pure, unfiltered horror, as if she had seen something no human should ever witness. I took a step closer, my hand shaking as I reached for her shoulder. The moment my fingers touched her skin, I recoiled. She was cold. Too cold. And then I noticed the scratches, long, deep gashes down her arms, like she had been clawing at herself. The pattern was unnatural, jagged, like something had torn into her. Panic surged through me. I backed away, stumbling over the rug, nearly crashing into the wall. This wasn't a heart attack or a stroke. Something had happened to her. Something terrible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. I turned to run, to get help, but as I reached the door, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head. In the far corner of the room, just out of the dim light, something shifted. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a pile of laundry or an oddly shaped piece of furniture. But then it moved again, too deliberate to be anything inanimate. It was hunched over, long arms almost brushing the floor, a twisted, emaciated form that defied all logic. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over bone, and its face was nothing but a gaping hole where a mouth should have been, black and bottomless. I couldn't scream. My throat locked up, paralyzed by fear. It didn't make a sound as it moved toward me, slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. I couldn't run, couldn't move. All I could do was watch as it came closer, that dark void where its mouth should have been growing larger, like it was sucking the very light out of the room. Then, without warning, it stopped. It stood just inches from me, its twisted form towering over my frozen body. I could feel the cold radiating from it, like standing in the shadow of something that shouldn't exist. For what felt like an eternity, it just stared at me, or at least, I think it was staring. There were no eyes, just that gaping, endless blackness where its face should have been. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human, wasn't anything I could understand, but the meaning was clear. It was hungry. I don't remember running out of Mrs. O'Connor's apartment. The next thing I knew, I was back in my own place, the door slammed shut behind me, gasping for breath. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was distant, muffled, as if the world around me was slipping away. I managed to choke out what I had seen, but even as I spoke the words, they sounded insane. A creature? In New York? It made no sense. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing outside my window. I let them in, pointing shakily to Mrs. O'Connor's door. They were in there for what felt like hours, talking in low voices. When they finally came out, their faces were pale, grim. One of the officers pulled me aside. "There's no sign of forced entry," he said, his tone careful. "But Mrs. O'Connor, she's gone." "Gone?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "But I saw her, she was right there." He shook his head. "There's no body. Just some strange marks on the walls. We'll have to investigate further." I tried to explain about the creature, but the words died in my throat. They wouldn't believe me. How could they? I barely believed it myself. They left with a promise to keep in touch, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever that thing was, it was gone. Or maybe it was never there. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't sleep. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak in the floorboards made my heart race. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still out there, watching me, waiting. And the worst part? Mrs. O'Connor wasn't the last. 2 nights later, it happened again. Another knock, this time from the apartment across the hall. And then another, and another, each one closer, each one leaving behind nothing but empty apartments and the stench of decay. Whatever it was spreading. And I couldn't stop it. Now, as I write this, I can hear the knock again. It's coming from just outside my door. I don't know what it wants, but I'm too tired to fight. Maybe it's my turn. Maybe it's always been coming for me. I'm sorry. I can't keep writing. The knocking is getting louder.